talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he asked this question. He says, "Hey, Paul," and he was talking, it doesn't really matter what he was talking about. It was something current event related. This is happening over here. This is happening over here. Paul, what do you think is going to happen? And blah, blah, blah. And I says, well, let me ask you a question. I said, what is the definition of market timing? And he goes, I don't know. And I says, it is any attempt to change or alter a portfolio based on a prediction or a forecast about the future. And he goes, oh, and then he recognized his error, that he was trying to predict where markets were going to go. But in general, this is a good question. A lot of people worry about market downturns, and I think it's worth talking about because a lot of times what people say to me is, I can't afford to take a loss in a market downturn because I'm too old. I don't have enough time for a recovery. And I thought, well, let's just talk a little bit about this. So this really gets down to how we put together an investment portfolio in the first place. Now, there's a guy that won a Nobel Prize in economics, and he came up with something that looks sort of like this. And what it was showing is return over here, and forgive my handwriting, it's terrible on this board, but over here was risk. And what he said was that when I am young, bulletproof, I got a long time to go, I can be all the way out here and take lots of risk. I don't care about market volatility. And market volatility is what we're talking about here. We're not risk of loss of everything. Because when I'm well diversified, I might be in 40, 50 countries around the world and tens of thousands of stocks. If all of those companies go simultaneously bankrupt, we got a bigger problem on our hands. We're talking about volatility when I talk about risk. Now, as I get older, what I want to do is I'm typically going to start to move this direction, move from right to left, and I'm going to start adding fixed income or bonds to the portfolio so that I can put up with the market volatility or when we have the downturns. Not if we have the downturns, when we have the downturns. So if we look at this, we might have 60%, 50% of our portfolio in stocks, 50 or 60, and then maybe 50 to 40% in bonds when I'm in retirement. And it's because of these market downturns. Well, if we look at how often these downturns occur, what we start to recognize it's a fairly frequent event. And the reason is because what we're doing is we're putting up with more volatility with stocks to get the higher expected return. How much difference? Well, let's say if you put $1 in treasury bills, where you have no volatility whatsoever, always goes up, never goes down historically, what happens with that dollar from 1926 to the end of 2022? Well, the answer is that dollar would have grown to $22. But if I had put the same dollar in large U.S. stocks as measured by the S&P 500, now we're looking at, I have a chart over there and it says about $14,000 is what it would have grown to. If we look at small company U.S. stocks, it's like $56,000. Big difference. And what we find is the reason that has happened is that there is more volatility I'm putting up with. So that's why returns have been historically better for stocks. Protects us from inflation. Now, what we find is that to put up with that volatility can be a little bit unnerving. So it helps to understand how often that volatility shows up. There was a great little chart on the internet, and it basically looked at the S&P 500. And what it showed was that on average, 5% downturns in the market occurred pretty frequently, about 3 times per year from 1953 through 2022. That's pretty frequent, 3 times per year. 10% downturns occurred on average about once per year. So not unusual at all. If we look at 15% downturns, about every 3 years, so it's not unusual to see these downturns. Now, how long do they last? Well, for the 5% downturns, they last about 43 days. For the 10% downturns, on average, 107 days. So it's not years and years for recovery, it's typically days is what we find. Now, the reason we really want to get into, why is it that markets have always recovered? And it gets down to how stock pricing occurs and how recoveries happen. So let's say that if we look at large value stocks, for example, historically, large value stocks sell for about 10 times earnings. So I get $1 for every 10, I get $1 of earnings for each $10 that I pay. Let's say that the earnings drop by 10%. So now the earnings drop down to about 90 cents. And let's say that the ratio remains the same, 1 to 10. What will my new price be? Well, my new price would be 9, right? So if we look at that, we go, oh my goodness, the stock market dropped 10%. Why? Because the earnings went down. Now, if we look at that and go, well, what do we do? Well, if we look at this as a company, we are going to say, I've got to get my earnings to go back up. How do I do that? Well, if I'm the CEO of the company, I'm looking at it and go, well, we sell stuff, right? And, we may be able to increase the sales. And if we increase the sales, maybe we can increase the earnings down here, okay? Well, what else can we do? Well, we might not be selling a lot of stuff, so we can reduce our cost of goods sold. We don't need to buy as much stuff to put in the thing that we manufacture, so we can reduce that expense and help the earnings to go back up. Or what we can do is we can lay off a lot of people, our operating expenses. Maybe we don't need to have as high electricity bills or keep the factory open for as long or whatever it is that we do. We can reduce that expense and help the earnings go back up. So there are a lot of different things that we can do as the board of directors, the CEO of the company, anybody that works for the company, a lot of things we can do to get those earnings to go back up. And that's exactly what they do. Well, you might ask the question, wouldn't it be better if we could just avoid the downturn altogether? Wouldn't that be nice? Well, that'd be great. But here's the problem. When news comes out that tells us that earnings might be lower way in the future, stock prices will go down in anticipation that the earnings will be lower. You've got to be able to predict the news ahead of time. Good luck with that. Not only that, but you've got another problem on your hands. You've got to be able to predict not only before it goes down, but also when it's going to go back up. You have to be right twice. It's hard enough to be right once. What we know about professional managers and even pension managers is that they typically reduce returns and increase volatility when they try this little game. So it's not something we want to try. What can we do as an investor? What we can do is not play these games, number one, even though they feel good and they feel like we've got control, but we don't. The better thing to do is go, what can I control? I can control my asset mix. How much I have in large companies, small companies, value companies, growth companies, international, US, fixed income, stocks, and then make sure that that is appropriate for my stage in my life. And make sure it's appropriate based on my portfolio and what I'm trying to do with it. That is a way better thing to focus on. Don't try to focus on figuring out where markets are going to go next. Nobody knows, and they don't do a good job of trying to do it anyway. Hope that helps.